looks like we're clear to start. Thanks everyone for joining today. Basically, going to be running through some topics that are near and dear to my heart, which are, kind of ways to think about attacker behavior and how to approach simulating those attacks in your network so you're prepared when a real attack takes place. So from a high level, I want to just go ahead and first dive into the agenda here. Essentially, we'll do a quick introduction on why this stuff is important, some of the things that really motivate looking into these areas, going through then the meter attack framework and talking about atomic red team and how it relates. Then some guides into how you guys can run those atomics in your own environment to help simulate an attacker in progress, and talking a little bit about purple teaming, kind of clearing up what that means compared to red teaming and how it's a useful exercise. And then we'll be able to dive in and have some time for questions. Perfect, thanks guys. So first, the introduction, right? So why does detection response matter? Detection response, that's ultimately what this webinar is really going to be focused on, is how do we detect and know about attacker activity? Well, there's a couple reasons why it's really important, even despite spending a lot of effort and having a strong external perimeter and a patched internal perimeter. Of course, having a strong security posture is important, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, right, there's unlimited tries for attackers to get into your network. One great example is email phishing, right? People have a greater phishing posture now. There's tons of tools out there to help you train your employee base and test your resilience. But ultimately, an attacker, if they don't get in on an email phish, there's nothing stopping them from trying again, right? You can block a domain. Those are cheap to purchase. You can block a specific command and control channel that comes out. They can set up more. The attackers can have many, many chances to continue kind of banging on the door of your network and trying to get in. That's why the concept of defensive depth is really important, and making sure that, okay, let's assume that an attacker will eventually get past our initial defenses. They will have some kind of foothold into the internal network, making sure that they are unable to do anything at that point is really important. So that's one of the reasons why, those unlimited tries and kind of assuming they will get in. Another reason is, one-day attack windows, right? Regardless of, how well configured and well patched you are, the concept of a one-day flaw, similar to a 0-day. If a 0-day is something where an attacker has a exploit or a vulnerability they know of that is not in the public yet, well, there's obviously nothing you're going to really be able to do to defend yourselves other than proactive kind of defensive depth, right? Because there's going to be no patch for that yet. If you have that service exposed to the public internet, especially, that's something an attacker can leverage to get initial access to that DMZ or that system. A 1-day is similar, but it's basically even when a patch is released or an exploit is released and it's kind of known and there's a patch publicly available, there's still going to be a gap between when that patch is released and you're able to patch that system. So there's always that gap of vulnerability that's going to kind of cyclically appear on your network perimeter, as well as obviously on the internal network. So it's important to be ready for that. And obviously it's very important to respond fast to those things and get them patched as soon as possible. But there is that concept of, hey, there's going to be a chance that someone's going to be able to exploit that before you're going to be able to patch it. Likewise, there's also insider threat, right? Someone operating from inside the network that has some, not good motivations, and you want to make sure you're kind of understand what that activity looks like and be able to detect against it. Again, prevention is super important, but it doesn't negate the need to do defense in depth. And a lot of times, detection response, those are the things that really matter in preventing an initial breach or even initial kind of security incident from becoming a major breach. And let's talk about a little bit about what a breach might look like, right? There's a lot of activities that an attacker may do. And that's where it starts to get a little bit complex, right? What things do we know? How do we know what to look for? There's a lot of different ways that an attacker could target a network. This is just one example. Something that very commonly used is LMNR and MTS poisoning to get hashes and pivot through there. Maybe they're exploiting your DevOps infrastructure, leveraging some vulnerabilities or weak passwords in something like Jenkins. Anyway, how do we decide what activity is worth monitoring on? How do we think about what an attacker's activity looks like? Well, that's something that Meter put a lot of work in their attack framework, which is basically an adversary tactics knowledge base and a framework for thinking about, the kind of things that an attacker is doing. And again, not only a framework, but a knowledge base of here are all kind of the known, documented attack signatures, things that an attacker may do. And it's a great way to kind of, look at what's happening and think about what you need to look for in a standardized way where you can look up, hey, this is the attacker kind of methodology, this is the attacker specific attacker activities, and this is what they look like. So again, what is the attack framework from Meter's own words? It's largely a knowledge base about adversary techniques, a breakdown and classification of offensively oriented actions that can be used against particular platforms such as Windows. And the key thing here that they highlight is, unlike prior work in the area, the focus isn't on specifically the tools and malware that adversaries use, but how they interact with systems during operation. So we're kind of taking a step back, looking at a higher level to think about this. And here's what that looks like, right? These techniques are enumerated in the attack framework, and it's basically explanation various things that an attacker may be doing as far as an attack, right? So we look at, modifying the bash history is one. And that'd be for a Linux attack. We can think about, account manipulation, credential dumping. That's obviously a huge one, especially in Windows environments when we're using things like Mimikatz and pivoting. So this is great. It's an awesome resource for diving in and giving us a way to think about attacker activity, giving us a way to label it, and giving us a way to, now even think about how do we test these things, right? So we have now an enumeration of potential attacker techniques. The next logical step is, well, what will I catch in my environment if I run these techniques? And how do we approach that, right? Well, Red Canary has put out an awesome open source collection of basically tests for each one of these Meter attack techniques that they call the Atomic Red Team. And what this is essentially is, here's a screenshot from their GitHub, is basically a YAML file that defines, not only the description of what the atomic is, but some instructions for how to run it. And so, if you wanted to test your environment on, hey, can I go ahead and make sure I'm detecting against these attack signatures that I'm concerned about, then you could go into the Atomic Red Team GitHub repository, and it could be as simple as just manually following their README, right? So it's going to go in here. This is an example of one. This specific is the technique of using Reg Server 32 to run a DLL. You could go ahead and just take everything on this GitHub, run it manually, and you'll be able to basically take that DLL, download it from GitHub, copy that command line in, and then you'll be able to go ahead and basically run this attack technique and see, hey, is it going to get caught by my EDR? Is it going to get caught by my IV? Now, obviously, running through all these manually is not maybe the best way to do things. There's a lot of ways that we can think about automating this process and making it a lot easier. Now, in the past, there actually are a ton of frameworks available for this. There's some PowerShell frameworks, there's some scripting frameworks, but we wanted to share something that we've open sourced back in November that could be very useful for this task. We basically built a Windows application GUI client interface for this. So you can run this on your Windows systems in kind of a GUI environment to figure out, hey, what do I want to run? And let me run through it. Now, how do you go ahead and go about this? Here's kind of a screenshot of the tool. It's relatively straightforward. We basically have this executable here that is aware of atomics and knows how to parse them, and is then able to create a test plan and run them while logging which ones were run and at which time, so you can compare back with your EDR, right? So essentially, to install this, it's relatively straightforward. You download the Tevora execution engine, you download the atomics, and you basically just have to either, if you have the exe, just run that, or you can compile it from scratch if you want to have like the compiled from the source version, or if you want to modify the code at all, that's obviously the way to go. You probably want to, ideally run these things with your AV not in block mode because you want to see them happen, unless you're wanting to test the block, but just in kind of monitor mode to make sure that it would block in practice, and getting those all set up. And again, the execution is essentially you're running that file, navigating to the unzip directory and atomics folder, and loading them all in and giving it a run. Now, it's worth noting, looking at this, right, we essentially are loading in the atomics that are selected in that folder, but you probably don't want to load all the atomics in. And in fact, there's some that you definitely don't want. There's attack techniques such as restarting a system. That's something you don't want to do, right? The other important thing to consider is here, you really want to run this stuff ideally on, if you're testing your detections, not on a production system. You want to set up a VM just for this, right? In fact, yeah, it's going to be really bad if you run this on a production system. If you have the chance of making a lot of things happen. So unless you're running a very specific atomic or very slow use case that you understand, you don't want to just run all the atomics on a prod system. What we usually recommend doing is, taking this, putting it onto a test system, usually a VM or maybe a workstation, but a VM is great because you can snapshot it at the state where all your tools are installed, everything's monitoring, it's ready to go, and then you can run the atomics and then revert the snapshot. So you're making sure that you have a clean gold image every time that you're running off and testing on. And again, it's going to show you, if you're leveraging our GUI, you'll be able to see all the commands that are going to run, and you can basically limit by editing the folder anything that you want to run on there. So you could have a very limited set of techniques if you want to test against, or again, if you're running it on a safe non-production system and you want to just go ahead and do all the techniques to see kind of what gets caught and compare that, cross-reference with your detection software, that is a great way to go as well. Either way, you're able to export a test plan ahead of time. So if you want to see, okay, here's all the commands that are going to be run, then you can get a good audit of, okay, I know what's going to be kind of happening as far as this test goes, and then I can go ahead and start the simulation and get that run against the environment. Now, again, what is the point of this, right? It's not just these things aren't doing a automated attack in the way that it's going to simulate a full breach. That's impossible until we figure out general AI, right? At this point, there's still a human element that's needed if we want to do the full end-to-end. But what this does is it will run many of those attack techniques, so you can kind of get that baseline of what you're able to see, what you're able to block, what you're able to detect, and make sure that that is tuned and ready for an actual attack. And that's where the phase of running these atomics that's really important is the review phase. So essentially, if you're just running this and you're just seeing it and not taking action, there's not going to be much value. But if you're looking at this and you're kind of tweaking, okay, well, let's make sure that we are blocking these kind of meter attack techniques, and we understand these attack techniques, and we're prepared to kind of defend and respond to them, then you're going to be in a much better position if an actual attack occurs. So typically what we recommend doing is, running the simulation, looking at the indicators of compromise that are generated, making sure, first of all, as a sanity check, that you are getting those alerts, that you're monitoring the right things, but also then tweaking the systems and making sure you're able to see the things that maybe missed the first time. Tweaking your processes, making sure that the data that's coming from one tool is bubbling up to where your SOC team or your response team are actually looking at. That's where a lot of the value comes in from running these things on your own and doing that testing, because it's going to just give you a great baseline, great kind of sanity check that the things you want to look at are supported and you're able to see what's going on there. So the next thing is, what kind of comes after, right? So there's obviously the ability to modify these atomics. So like I mentioned, it's awesome that these are open source, that allowed us to build this tool on top of it, but it also means the community can contribute to it, or you can tweak them yourselves. Essentially, these are just YAML files that give commands. So there's kind of a limited flexibility in tweaking which commands are run, and what each attack technique in each atomic is. So there's room for these to be tweaked and changed to kind of keep it fresh. But again, that can be kind of a long process and not always super valuable, but it is something that can be used to kind of keep the atomics that you're running, if you're checking these regularly, at a more recent level or more appropriate to your environment if necessary. There's also actually doing a full attack chain, right? So like I mentioned, if you're running the atomics, you're going to be having a lot of just attacker adversary techniques being basically running down a list and executing, which obviously in real life an attacker is never going to do that. They're going to be trying to use at least as many of these as possible to meet their goal, and they're going to be doing it across many systems and servers as they kind of execute the attack map to get to that point in time. And so what's the best way to go into that attack chain, right? Is it a pen test? Is it a red team? Is it a purple team? Well, the answer is kind of all of them are good, but want to shed some light specifically on purple teaming, because there is a lot of confusion out there on what it means. And part of that is it's still kind of like an undefined term in the way that, there's a lot of people think about it differently. There's a lot of different ways to approach it, and that's okay, because there is some flexibility in how to approach it. And really what's important is, just highlighting the synergy between the red team and the blue team. And what is the red team and the blue team, right? So a red team is essentially, typically the offensive team that is trying to hack into the network to kind of demonstrate what an attack chain would look like. The blue team are the folks that are defending the network, trying to be able to see, can they detect the red teamers? Can they detect the attackers? Are they able to respond? In a standard red team situation, you might have like a black box test where, yeah, you have some scope of, hey, you're targeting this company, here's the things you're allowed to do, and you're able to go to specific specific scope to execute that however way you can, and the blue team just has to respond. But a purple team kind of combines that, where you're now working a little bit together. And what is the advantage of working together? Well, you can basically look at the attack path collaboratively. Which the reason why that's great is because you can now start tweaking things, right? So if there's a red team, you may go from a phishing breach to an execution, and you may find a way to do that. And the blue team may be missing some things, right? And then when they come back to improve, they have to come back in later and kind of look at the report, compare the things, look at what they were collecting, and then, okay, now we got to dive back out and make those fixes. Whereas if you're doing it in a purple team, the red teamer can be sitting there next to them or on a virtual conference call, especially in this quarantine, and show, hey, look, I'm running this right now. I'm running Mimikatz on the system, or I'm doing curb roasting and I'm able to get these SPNs. Are you able to see this activity? Here's some ways you can detect that. The blue team right there can go tweak their things. Okay, try running that again. Let's see if I can see that now. Or even trying multiple payloads. The advantage of this is you can be kind of iterative and kind of iteratively improve what your defenses look like, and kind of test, attack, retest, really have a good way to kind of improve things just in time and interactively. And we found that doing this approach actually is really great for a lot of folks, especially on the blue team, but also the red team as well, because you get to learn from each other, okay, this McAfee tool is actually able to catch this thing. CrowdStrike's able to look at this thing, whatever it may be. And the blue team's able to say, like, oh, I forgot I need to have this feed going into here, or, I need to tweak this setting on. And you find that you're able to just really sweep up a lot of low-hanging fruit really quickly on those detections, and really upgrade your detection ability in your environment by doing things like this. And again, unlike a red team where typically you may be going to very narrow but very deep to a specific goal, on the purple team, you have the ability to, again, attack, test, attack again, kind of retread over things, try different techniques to do things like, hey, we may want to run Mimikatz on the system. Well, let's run safety cats first, which see if that gets detected. Okay, then let's run straight Mimikatz. Let's run our payload that's been obfuscated, it's more advanced. Let's tune that down and run a less advanced payload and see if it gets to get caught. On a red team, obviously, you're just going to use the one that's not going to get caught, that you think is not going to get caught. Use the most advanced one and hope it doesn't get caught. But on a purple team, you have the ability to start acting in that spectrum for the purpose of trying to measure that detection and work together to improve it. And one of the signatures of a purple team, I'd say some of the things that you really need to make it be worthwhile is one, you want to be using advanced payloads. And what I mean, that's something somewhat custom, something that's not going to get caught by AV. You don't want to just be running Interpreter on a system, right, where it's going to get caught and say, oh, I got it. Really, you want to be, still in the red team sense, running advanced command and control, simulating APTs, having advanced payloads, because that's going to be important for measuring the ability of the blue team to respond in a real scenario and tweak the tools to it. So you want to make sure that you're doing kind of the best stuff, and you're still trying to do that all evasion, even though, like I said, you may want to operate in a spectrum where you do some more advanced payloads, you do some ones that are more likely to get caught, so you can kind of see where that line is. And again, I know I've been highlighted this a few times, but really, the advantage of being able to go in and just keep doing the same thing while the blue team's tweaking things, being able to try things on different levels, iterating and collaborating on that. It's really powerful in the ability to just kind of get a lot of test cases understood by the blue team really quickly, and get rules tweaked so things are a lot more able to respond to attacks. Now, one of the advantages too, again, versus running atomics is obviously, executing that full attack chain. I just have a screenshot of Blend here to kind of visualize this, but, typically if an attacker is in a network, a huge part of getting to a position where, they don't just have high privileges, but, are accessing the data they want to access is going to involve pivoting. And of course, there's a lot of methods to do that, whether it's WMI, win remoting, or, SSH, whatever they're doing. And be able to try multiple pivoting methods and kind of measure that across the organization, as well as across, categories of servers, whether it's, moving from an initial workstation all the way to moving towards, access to a domain controller. The types of systems that you're going to touch along the way may have different levels of security control on them. So having that kind of broad look at, or rather I should say deep look at the network, where you're kind of looking at that slice across multiple different kinds of systems, and you're pivoting realistically through them, that's going to generate a lot of good data for the blue team. Now, why do a purple team over a red team? Or when is a red team something that is going to be a lot more valuable than running a purple team. Well, here are some advantages, right? A red team is a true black box test typically. I mean, obviously there's still some flexibility there in how white box or black box you want it to be, but typically if we're looking at kind of the purest definition, you'd be coming in and a red team would be coming in and basically looking at, hey, we're going to get to whatever the goal of the test may be, whether it's credit card numbers or whether it's access to the AWS account or whether it's leak of PII or EPHI. And the attacker is basically going to go through that until they reach that goal. And the advantage, some of this is it's a forcing function to ID actual potential attack paths. When you're collaborating, you may try different things or things may not be on, or, you'll have the advantage of being able to tweak and iterate on the red team side. It's still pretty good and usually realistic, but, if you're doing a full black box test, well, you're kind of, by definition, the attack path that's going to result is something that would be realistic to an actual real attacker, just because it's forced to be by the fact of the rails the tests are on. But you do have some limited ability to explore multiple vectors, right? A lot of the time on the red team is spent on, making sure that you're evading things, moving slowly. You're not going to be triggering a lot of alarms on the way or trying a lot of things because you're going to be doing the bare minimum. And when I say bare minimum, I'm saying the bare minimum activity, so you're not getting caught, right? Because that's the primary goal of the red team. And you could repeat it, multiple times, doing different ones, but ultimately, that can be expensive, right? A red team is a pretty time-intensive engagement. There's a lot of care put into, crafting payloads, crafting these things, and being careful not to have them get burned by the blue team during the engagement. And so these things are, going to limit you in what, kind of slice you're going to see as far as activity goes. And that's something where on the purple team, you can come in and be like, well, let's just try all these things because we want to see if they get caught. We aren't necessarily not trying to get caught. We want to make sure the full coverage is there. So you do have some limited ability to explore multiple vectors in that time frame. And again, there's also limited just-in-time fixing. Typically, the way a red team would go is, you might check in with a project sponsor, or maybe even the blue team at certain points in time. But typically the major debrief doesn't happen to the end. And that's effective for sure, going through, hey, here's what the attack activity was, here's, what we did, here's the, raw dump log of all the commands that were run. That's a great tool for the blue team, undoubtedly. But there's something that just seems to be missing versus, having that just-in-time ability to tweak, them be able to see the thing happening live and go back and look at their tools right there. It tends to be a little less effective as far as getting both an intuitive understanding for what's going on with the attack activity, but also the ability to respond and fix to it. And then kind of tied directly to that is that interactive learning is a little less. So typically I described it, but I don't know if I answered the question when to do a red team. A red team is really when you want to do more of an audit, right? When you're looking at, okay, I'm not necessarily trying to come in and improve my posture. I just really want to understand it. And I do want to improve my posture. I do want to improve vulnerabilities, but I really want to understand what a real attack would look like, forced to be a real attack by the constraints of it being black box and on the same type of controls that an attacker would be led into, which is basically, attackers not limited to the scope they can hit. They can hit physical, they can hit social engineering, but they are limited in the knowledge they have typically. So, especially depending on the threat model. That's going to give you kind of a realistic look at, okay, what did an actual attack look like? How was I able to respond? And, what did they exploit? And what was the forcing function that, that led them to that actual exploit? But a purple team is great for kind of preparing for something like that and just overall improving your security posture while maybe compromising the measurement of, what it looks like a little bit. Though again, both are in the end relatively similar in the results of, improving security posture and measuring current state, which is probably the most, obviously improving is probably my top priority list, but measuring can be important as well if you're trying to figure out where you are and where you've come from, which can be interesting. So conclusions, there's some great free resources out there, right? The Meter attack framework is awesome. We've been leveraging that, again, not only as a way to just think about what attack activity looks like, but it's just good knowledge base for what attack activities are out there. And, there's always the risk of it becoming stale or things of that nature. Obviously things are changing, but one of the advantages it has against other attempts in the past, like Meter mentioned, was they are using a more general description of attack activity that can be adapted towards, newer technologies as different approaches are made to those same general techniques. And of course, new techniques are being included as they come along. Now, atomics are obviously much more specific because, if you look in that repo, they are literally a collection of commands defined in a configuration file. So those are very specific, but they are very important to look at as well. So those are things that are great to look at and run. And again, they're free and they're awesome. And they're something that, I'd recommend, again, putting them in a lab environment, installing your tools on there. And even if it's something where you're just using it to evaluate, what EDR solution you want to purchase, there's a ton of ways you can use these things. And it's really great, especially as a sanity check. Probably my favorite use case for it is, doing a sanity check to make sure that your detection mechanisms are actually reaching where you're expecting them to reach. What I mean by that is they're making it all the way up to the SOC. They're making it all the way up to, your SIM or your alerting system. It's a great sanity check to make sure all the things are coming across. And I see a question in the chat. Can you post a link to download this tool? Yep. So the Red Team GUI tool, that is on GitHub. I can post the link to that as well. That is something that, again, is free and open source. So feel free to mess around with it, tweak it. We've had a lot of fun with it. The only caution I would say, again, I'd probably usually not run these atomics, especially unless you're running a very narrow group of them on production servers, just because some of them can be kind of crazy, especially the one that restarts the system. I mean, it's definitely going to not be good to run in a production environment. But yeah, definitely play around with the tool. It's been a lot of fun to hack on, and it's really great as far as, kind of visualizing the attack plan and what's going to happen. Now, another kind of conclusion here is, Purple Team can get a lot of the benefits out of Red Team, and sometimes even more, especially when it comes to, getting full coverage of, what your detections look like and improving them as you're doing the test. And it's often at a much lower cost, right? Because a Red Team, a lot of the time is spent on trying to get in, right? You're spending a lot of time, okay, email template didn't work, create a new one. This domain's burned, create a new domain, cook that domain, get it categorized. There's a lot of effort that goes into that just results in cost, which is why Red Teaming can be such a kind of expensive endeavor. And a lot of folks don't really pursue that until either they are a very large organization or they're an organization with a very mature security posture with a lot of investment in that. Where Purple Teaming, really you can do that at the same level of a pen test, right? The main difference is instead of hiring a pen test team to come in and having them kind of be hands-off or having your team be hands-off, you're really a lot more involved in the process. Now, that does require more of a time commitment from, your team, yourself, to be involved in that because, it's really only going to be a value add as far as, you have involvement in that testing. But it's as simple as, bringing yourself to be involved and you're sitting there with the tester and walking through the things that are being running, checking your stuff, asking that, being not afraid to come in and ask the tester to repeat something or dive in and, go down a rabbit hole on something you're interested in and honing your detections on. But ultimately, it's very similar to an internal pen test where you're either given, a starting point of, hey, we're detonating a payload on this workstation, and that's going to be the scenario from here, assuming a phishing breach, or we're going to plug a device into the network, and that's assuming, either inside a threat or physical breach or someone's plugged something in. That's one of the great advantages of Purple Teaming is it doesn't have to be super expensive like Red Teaming does, because just by the nature of how much time Red Teaming takes to do a black box test, that is kind of fully end to end. So that's one of the advantages as well is lower cost, which is always good. Great. And I see another question in the chat, which is a lot of visibility depends on Sysmon. What if your apps team typically does not want to run Sysmon due to the amount of noise? Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny too when, Sysmon ultimately actually is at the core of a lot of EDR solutions. And obviously, why would you pay for an EDR solution when you have Sysmon? Well, essentially, you're paying for them to filter out that noise because they, are basically looking at, okay, what is the real stuff here and kind of filtering those alerts to get to something that is useful. In the same vein, this can help you kind of filter Sysmon alerts by looking at, okay, what are the real things of an attack? So you can go and run Sysmon on the system that a Purple Team is occurring on or that you're running the atomics on. Compare the time frame of the Sysmon logs to the activity that is taking place and highlight the things that are important for you to capture. Now, of course, these may change. Obviously, techniques are going to change. But you'll cover a lot of that stuff and hopefully highlight a lot of things that are, especially common that attackers are doing. So you can cover, again, the basics and the high-level attack techniques that Meter is talking about, well, hopefully filtering out the noise. Now, again, a lot of this is going to be difficult without a good way to filter through that stuff. So, ideally, you'd want these logs going to some kind of scene that you can filter, like, Elastic and Elk Stack with Kibana, or, Splunk, or, if you have like a purpose-built system like Logarithm, they can help you filter through those things. Or, a lot of the shortcuts we see people take is just buy an EDR because they're, it's funny, not all the EDRs use Sysmon directly, but there are a lot out there that if you look under the hood, they're pretty much just using Sysmon and then, putting rules on top of that to make it very useful and kind of forge it down into something that is a lot more valuable than just the raw Sysmon output. But I think you highlight something there with that question that is actually, really important, right? And it's one of the internal struggles of information security defenders is how do you sift through the noise? And that's a tough question. That's probably something that needs a whole, not even webinar, but like kind of course in itself to cover. But hopefully, these atomic red teams and exercises are something that help you get a better intuitive understanding to what this attack activity looks like, right? Which helps you get intuitive understanding for how do I filter down this noise, and that intuitive understanding can be leveraged into crafting rules that help actually literally bring down that noise. That's something that is going to be super valuable for getting those alerts to be more actionable. But yeah, ultimately, it's a great question and something that unfortunately still is relatively difficult or expensive. If you just EDR is expensive, they know that it's good and that it can find a lot of stuff, and as a result, there's a lot of it can be pretty pricey to get that stuff in the environment. Sysmon is great, but it's very noisy, and it is still a lot of work to filter that down. But there are ways to approach it, and these hopefully can be kind of helpful ways to think about what you're concerned about in the environment and tie those back down to Sysmon alerts. Hopefully that answered that question in some way. Unfortunately, no easy direct way to address it, but it's definitely, there's a lot of ways to cut the cookie there. All right, with that, I want to just open up to the floor. If there's any questions, anything you want me to dive into, either on, if you want me to dive into how the tool works and using that a little more in atomics, or any questions on purple teaming, definitely open to kind of talk through anything you guys may be curious about. Okay, great. It doesn't sound like there's any other questions. With that, I'll start wrapping it up here. I mean, ultimately, I hope you guys leverage the stuff that's out there, some of the free tools, and let me link the actual thing in the URL right now. The atomics and meter framework is great. And it's something that we've been looking at kind of actually including into our reports. We have in a few cases already. They're also something that again are just there's a lot of use cases for them. So it's definitely something I recommend at a minimum getting familiar with. And also one of the things I love about information security is other than hacking on stuff. And I just sent the URL to the tools. Other than hacking on stuff is just the amount of open source stuff out there to hack on, right? So, we obviously didn't build the atomic framework. We just built, a GUI around it, but hopefully it's useful for folks. And I would just kind of encourage people like, hey, look at the stuff that's out there, and feel free to hack on it and post stuff back. It's really awesome the amount of open source resources there are. I'm just continually surprised to see the quality of stuff in the open source community in general, but particularly around the security community. And everything that people are willing to share. So really enjoy, messing with that stuff and looking at it and trying to find ways to improve it. And so if there's anything I would tell people is just, yeah, definitely look into open source as far as the things that are out there. Keep up to date with it because there's a lot of, really cool projects from everything from, again, the high level attack and meter framework to the specific tools and things that people are releasing. And there's a lot of stuff that you can do without having to buy an expensive commercial solution that can get you, a lot of security improvement.